Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to have two very important talks, and we're going to get started. First, I'm going to introduce the two presenters of the first talk, and then I'll present the presenters of the second talk later. Okay. First, Dr. Larkin McReynolds from Columbia University. Caveat: I know all speakers today very well. They're good friends of mine, so I'm a little biased, but I wanted to be official and read out the end of the thing. Dr. McReynolds is a member of Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group, our group, GPEG, where she's involved in the identification of youth's mental health and substance use behavior, particularly among those involved in the juvenile justice system. She was responsible for overseeing all Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, Department of Epidemiology, MPH master students and their thesis. Dr. McReynolds is currently leading a national investigation of psychological consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on the mental health of college students. She's a co-investigator on the Columbia University of Guyana Research in Injury and Trauma Training, the GRIT program. Dr. Ellen G. Denton is a clinical psychologist with extensive experience providing psychological consultation services in Guyana since 2014, especially to service providers of the orphanage population. She has a strong foundation in conducting training and mentoring that has contributed to building suicide prevention clinical research capacity in resource-limited settings. Dr. Denton is a co-investigator on the Guyana Wellbeing Study and a consultant to the Columbia University and UG GRIT program, which we mentioned before, and we had a session earlier today. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Larkin.
Yes, thank you very much, George. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Let me put this on. Great. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the suicide risk among emerging adults, or we call them college students in the United States, that we've learned in our recent study. And then also to have Ellen G. fill this in with her real world clinical experience during this time. So just to set the stage, back in like February or March of 2020, what I want to talk about today is really describe kind of what was the public health clinical concerns that were at play even before the pandemic, and then talk about how this has impacted their not only mental health, but their lives. And then I'll give you some snippets of what we've learned in our COVID college pandemic survey, and then have Ellen G. fill it in with her real world experience in the clinic. So for a perspective, in the United States, we have over 15 million undergraduates, young adults emerging developmentally at a time when they're supposed to be experiencing everything in their life, and then wham, the pandemic hits. So you have to imagine that people who are in college are among the healthiest individuals. They're at the peak part of their lives. They have experiences they're expecting. And then we have to think about what is going to be the lasting consequences of going through not only an emergent pandemic stressor, but as we now know very well, the prolonged stress of living now 2 years into it, an existing stress. And that's something in our GPEG group, Global Psych Epi, that is always in our minds of how does living through a prolonged stress impact not only your mental health, but other life post, consequences. So thinking about the trajectories that they were on, we know very well now that life stopped. It was clear that things changed. Many were forced to move off campus, which also imparted other consequential things in terms of their health. So what did we know about college students before the pandemic? We already knew they had high rates of substance use and mental health. From a recent study in 2019, before the pandemic, is that the prevalence of substance use disorders, particularly binge drinking, was about 40%. So this is harmful, hazardous drinking. This is when a lot of experimentation happens. And then NIDA had put out a report in 2018, is that between the years right up before the pandemic, that there had been a 7% increase in marijuana use in this age group. And by far the most single greatest year increase in any substance reported by NIDA in the Monitoring the Future study was related to marijuana use and nicotine vaping among college students. So that said about substance use, what we also knew about mental health diagnoses and suicidality is that suicide is the second leading cause of death among this age group, 18 to 24. Over a quarter have been treated for, diagnosed or treated for depression in the past year. And then over 1/5 had sought out, had thoughts about suicide and reporting self-injury, non-suicidal. So, you know, really what the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention had put out even before the pandemic was that suicide prevention on college campuses needs to happen, is necessary, and it needs to be providing services. This recommendation was only compounded by the impact of the pandemic. So when we think about how COVID impacted college students, is that we already knew there was a crisis of substance and mental health in college students. We already knew that mental health services had been increased by over 1/3 prior to the pandemic. And now you imagine that they're told to leave campus. Many students were, a lot of what campus life provided them with was a lot of support. Friend support during a developmentally important time where you're supposed to forge new relationships, find out what you want to do, become financially independent, religiously independent, and grow. But also remember what the supports colleges provided, not only food for them, but also housing and work study programs that they were involved with. So this creates a chasm of millions of students who were financially struggling, academically struggling, emotionally struggling, and not only to think of their lost experiences during and expectations that they had. So what our GPED group came together with some really big national collaborators, not only related to academic life and the American colleges of universities, but mental health, the JED Foundation and Active Minds, but also other supportive groups like the National Education Association and NCAA. So we quickly mounted together impact to outreach to students. We first went through schools. In the middle of the height of the pandemic, that became unrealistic, and we targeted students where they were, is online. So we went to social media recruiting through Facebook and Instagram, and we had a good response in that. So just to give a broad pass on what we did in our online survey, is we talked a lot about the COVID experience, not only related to their actual exposures, but their academic related. You know, were they transferring? Did they take a gap year? Did they change majors? how did this influence, the messages they were receiving from their colleges or universities. We talked about changes in their daily life, in their social support. We also talked about the importance of their employment and finances, a job loss, themselves, their family, really about ability to pay for their basic needs during that time, as well as their food security. So one thing I'll talk about in our health today is the focus on this talk is the impact on their suicide ideation and self-injury during these times. But we also have a whole spectrum of anxiety, depression, agoraphobia, loneliness, panic, post-traumatic stress, as well as functional impairment during this time. One thing I think to point out that was important in our approach to this study is because we didn't need a study about, is depression, anxiety going to go up? Is loneliness going to go up? You didn't need a study for that. But we thought a unique approach to this was figuring out how their decision-making styles and their values orientation was helping to explain why we expected to see high rates of anxiety, depression, and associated. So suicidality this is just part of the results, was somewhat higher than what we expected. And the CDC put out a MMWR report in June of 2020 that showed in 18 to 24-year-olds was about 25%. So that was nationally in college, non-college. But what we saw in just looking at an agenda breakdown is that it was primarily past year or recent attempts was very much highly elevated in our males. So when we talk about risks, what we found just in a pass in our study, the risk for suicide ideation and behaviors was highest among those who were reporting also moderate to severe depression, and they ranged between 2 to 8% higher. That's not unexpected given that depression is associated with suicide and ideation and suicide attempts. We also saw that moderate to severe anxiety is highly associated with that. Importantly, thinking about vulnerable populations is that those that describe themselves as being LGBTQ status had a much higher elevated rate of ideation and suicide attempt. Males definitely higher, as we saw on the previous slide. Interestingly enough, these two are related to more social, economic aspects of college students, is those who were experiencing COVID-related financial hardship were 1.5 to 2 times more higher to report having recent, like current, while they were taking the survey online, as having COVID-related financial hardship. And those that were in community college regarding actual current, are you thinking about suicide right now, were 2 times more likely. So there's probably some overlap between financial hardship experienced by COVID and those that are in community college, because in the US, community college are usually, students tend to be a little bit older, so they have more financial responsibilities, either in their residential life or in their child rearing life at that time. So when we switch now to non-suicidal self-injury, and we'll see some overlap, but not more. One difference being is that we see higher rates of females, 30, almost double, reporting lifetime experience. And then, but when we look at past year, it's almost equivalent between genders. But more importantly, when we look into past year, is that more males were reporting recently cutting at the time of completing the survey. Like, have you in the past week started cutting? So again, we see that's interesting about the increased rates among students who reported non-suicidal self-injury is those reporting LGBTQ status were over double more likely to report non-suicidal self-injury, as well as those who report depression, anxiety. And here we see a flip, is that those students who were in traditional four-year college students were almost double or a little, nearly double more likely to report non-suicidal self-injury versus their community college two-year students. So when we think about risks for non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors, I think on the radar is female, LGBTQ status, depression, anxiety, and being in a four-year college student. I think what's important to take through on the measure that we used to record non-suicidal self-injury is that the importance, that frequency of hiding the non-suicidal behavior, here we asked particularly about cutting, is that the frequency of that behavior and the hiding was more likely to be associated to having need to seek medical attention for the injury. So there's some very much theories around why people engage in non-suicidal behavior. And it's about to feel real. It's about to have control over somewhat of an uncontrollable situation and to experience that. So some of our next steps in our study is to examine the associations with substance use and how that's associated. NIDA, National Institutes on Drug Abuse, recently published a report that actually in this age group, substance use went down for first time in 20 years. However, in the literature that I've read is that among those who had higher rates of depression and anxiety in this college age group had a higher use of substances during this time, which was particularly led by female alcohol use during the time. And then, as I explained earlier, our unique approach to studying the impact of the pandemic on college students is that we want to examine how their decision-making styles, not only their self-report, but also the measures on more behavioral, economic, task-based measures mediate these associations with suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury. So that all said, I dropped that. Maybe, but I would invite Ellen G to give her experience on how the students that she's seen during the pandemic in the clinic.
Thank you, Dr. McReynolds. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Are you able to show those slides?
Did you send them to me, or do you want me to put them up?
Yes, thank you. And I'll just let you know to advance them if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. While she gets those slides up, it's actually quite serendipitous that while Dr. McReynolds was collecting this rich data and characteristically describing and demographically describing the risk of suicide among college students, that I was engaging at the same time with these college students in the emergency department in upstate New York. And so a lot of what I am going to share actually overlaps with her description of the risk. And hopefully I can offer some clinical insights and some understanding of how these young persons presented when they were in the emergency department.
So
I would-
Ellen, I'm just gonna cut you off. I don't see your email with the slides. But if you,
We said at 10:43 a.m.
okay,
And 12 seconds.
If you're unable to find it, then I can go through it. You know, I know the slides. But if you are able to find it, that'll be good.
okay.
Thank you. So the first slide was a picture of the University of Rochester Medical Center and the Center for Suicide Prevention Studies, which is a hospital, a clinical hospital, a medical center, and a teaching institution. And there, they've been doing research on suicidal patients for over 40 years. And so I was a part of a pretty elaborate randomized clinical trial where they were offering a therapy for patients directly after they had their suicide attempt, within 10 to 30 days after they attempted suicide. So before I move forward, I just want to paint the picture that the young persons would have actually had the suicide attempt, and they would be stabilized in the emergency department. Some of them went to observation for 72 hours. Others were admitted for inpatient, and others would have been there for like 3 or 4 days and stabilized prior to being offered this therapeutic treatment. Yeah. Then I would step in and I would try and recruit them to go into this treatment. And I saw probably more than 250 people. And of those 250, the average age was 23. I think the median age I wrote in the slide is 23 and the mean age is 26 years old. So for the most part, we did have persons as young as 18 years old, and we went all the way up to adults on an average age around 20. This is over the course of 2021 to 2022. Concerning the risk of these patients, there's 2 ways that I'm going to present to you. 1, their methods of injury, and then 2, what their chief complaints were. So first, the methods of injury, because Dr. McReynolds spoke so eloquently about their the use of medication. Most of the patients that presented, the young, were marijuana dependent, and that was counted or treated differently than their addictions. Some had cocaine addictions, some had alcohol addictions, all sorts of substance use addictions. But what they described to be their dependency on marijuana was, it ranged from anything. I need marijuana to work, I need marijuana to sleep, I need marijuana to, before I talk with my romantic partner, I need marijuana was one of the ways that we understood how they function. And then we would follow up and try to understand if there was some sort of substance use. And so I don't know where Guyana is on that, but in New York, we have legalized marijuana use. And a lot of the young persons were not using the marijuana to be, I think the point is, they were not using marijuana to be as leisure. Most of them expressed some sort of dependency for whatever they needed to do in life. That's one. The second method of injury that I think is quite pertinent when talking about college students and emerging adults is that they had traffic accidents and different types of injurious behavior that sometimes upon screening in the emergency department, they would say is unknown intent. And they would not, without careful questioning, we would not know that it was a suicide attempt. So they would express things, and this has been backed up with registry data in Canada. Ray et al. Has published really great data on how young persons present to the emergency department, and it sounds like they were walking in traffic or crossing the street, but with further probing, they learned that that was actually a suicide attempt. So sometimes, and they actually adopted this in the Center for Suicide Prevention Studies, when young persons presented with accidental injury, they would not automatically rule out a suicide attempt. In fact, we would ask questions like, what percentage of you actually wanted to die? And we tried to understand intent by intent of the behavior. When you were walking in the traffic, did you intend to walk in the traffic, heavy traffic, or did you intend to lay down in the traffic because you wanted to die? And so we had to ask questions about not only the intent of the behavior, but the intent to death. And those were two different things. Yeah. So method of injury was quite, I mean, there were ranges, methods of injury. Self-injurious behavior also, third point, self-injurious behavior also included harm to body that lethality was unclear. And so clinically, we would question and probe not only for different types of intent, but we would probe differently for lethality. So for example, I had a young person who was 18 years old, and she was using a sharp brick object to rub against her leg. And she rubbed all the way down past to muscle, skin was off, and it was quite gruesome. And once she was stabilized, she expressed, no, I was not doing this just to hurt myself and to get rid of the pain. If I could have died this way, I wanted to feel the pain. And as I was going from being healthy to being in pain and injured, then going on to death. And she explained that this was a process that she had chosen to go through. Now, in that might not be as considered as lethal as jumping off a bridge, which we also did have young persons who did that as well. But the point is there that the questioning around the lethality was actually separate from their clinical intent. And that was, so you can have a high lethal means with a low intent, and vice versa. You can have a high intent and low lethality, just like that person. We also had jumping off of high places. There were several bridges in the area, and we did not count a suicide attempt if they had not jumped. So they had to have been in air. We had several young persons who crashed into the barrier on a bridge. In New York State, we're moving towards putting netting under all bridges. Big effort coming from Albany. Eventually, hopefully, we will get there. There's actually a CDC grant that was funded this summer to do that. But if they were on the bridge and thinking about it, if they were on the bridge and someone de-escalated them and talked them down, or if they were on the bridge and going and crashed into the barrier, which we also had, they were not considered to have had a suicide attempt. If they were in air suspended and someone met them at the bottom and rescued them, it was considered a suicide attempt. And so that is just to paint a little bit of the picture between the intent and the lethality and what type of question. The last piece that I want to really highlight in the method of injury, and there's several other methods, but one in particular last year was overdosing. A lot of the young people would ingest things, household items that were easily accessible, and they would express that, I know that if I took this amount, nothing would happen. So I just decided, I don't know how much would be the most harmful, but I just decided to take all of that. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because emergency response to suicide is quite important. Last night we learned about the golden hour. And if something is happening, you want to have a quick and immediate response, because we were in a very small area and with a lot of emergency medical services and also mobile crisis. And because we have 988 chat lines and such, people were able to respond very well. And the young person would actually wake up in the hospital and say, oh, wow, I did not think that someone would have caught me, or I did not think, I thought I was really gone. But they were actually really shocked at how important it was, or how people responded, how they posted something and someone immediately responded, and now mobile crisis was at their door. And so I just wanted to highlight how those emergency responses were vital and critical, especially for young people who probably weren't thinking about the timing of what they were doing. But people responded, best friends responded, texts were sent, notices were highlighted, and they said, and then someone would be at the door. And that was really great in saving many of the young people's lives. So we had a range of injuries, those are the methods of injury. And then, so I wanted to end by saying a little bit of what we responded to, how we responded to them, and what actually offered some, I think, hope for some of the young people there. So most of the chief complaints that the young people had, there were three. Most of the chief complaints that the young people had were, one, finances. Just as Dr. McReynolds presented, it's a financially hard and humble time in your early 20s, yeah? And a lot of them would say things like, I tried to find a therapist, I applied for insurance and I'm rejected. I cannot find anyone who is willing to talk with me, and I have a lot of things that I want to talk about, and no one really listens. My family members don't listen. My friends are great, but I need, a little bit more than that. And I don't know where to go. So you know what? They would listen to me and that was very difficult. The good thing was, in our case, we were offering this therapy free of charge. And most of them, again, our average age is 23 and 26, respectively, mean and median age. Most of them enrolled. They were the easiest people to enroll. They were the easiest collaborators in the study. Again, I loved all of the patients that we worked with across the lifespan, but by far, the young people were very cooperative and willing to hear wanting a professional's time to really tell their story. And literally at some point in the program that we offered, we would say things like, we understand that when you get to the point where you would attempt suicide, that you probably have a lot to say about it. We want to hear your story. And they would talk. They were very cooperative. That's the first piece. The second piece was there were a lot of unstable relationships. So they would say things like, and this is complicated and I think a quite sensitive area. They would learn information about their relationships online. They would learn about how someone felt about them on a Twitter or Instagram post or a Facebook post. And some of that cut really deep. So you had very reactive young persons to things that they found out in a very distant way that they thought the person was close to them. A lot of the young people were looking for guidance and purpose and mentoring around these relational issues. Do I cut them off? Obviously, I'm going to unfriend them, but how do I move on from here? I thought they were my best friend, or can they just be someone who comes over at night? They did not know how to navigate certain relationships. If I don't go steady with them, or if I'm not taking it to a next level with them, how can I use this or engage in this relationship to my advantage? Is that wrong? Is it not? There were a lot of questions, and they really wanted adults. And sometimes trusted peers, certainly, who they can talk to about these things. So those unstable relationships were issues, and really purpose and guidance was quite responsive and quite useful. They just wanted to hear someone explain, so how did you stay in that relationship for X amount of time? Yeah. The last thing was collaborative problem solving. A lot of them had limited solutions to their stresses. So with the limited solution, they would express, I only see it this way or this way, the black and white thinking, and we all know about that. And to have someone who they can collaborate with, problem solve, how to cope in that stressful situation, especially when they're disengaged from school during the COVID pandemic, when they're disengaged from work and really have no relational buffers around them. The question was, well, what's my alternative unless I run an Uber cab? People ran Uber and delivered food a lot during the pandemic. And so, and young persons who had license to do that, they would say, well, maybe I should just run Uber or drive or do something else because I can't stay in this house. And that would be the only alternative to the stresses, their family stresses in the house. While there are several other alternatives, but they have no one to process that with and talk through. So collaborative problem solving, there's a range of that can go from professional to lay person, but I think that would be resource, and that served as resource for us who saw those patients in the hospital. So hopefully I painted a picture of what their chief complaints were, stable relationships, inability to problem solve through personal stressors, and then also unable to find professionals and therapists because of insurance issues and financial issues. And then we had, in some cases, immediate responses, but because it was a long-term program with a lot of infrastructure, and yeah, we can also offer them long-term solutions that I did not offer, but they walked them through it. I think the last thing that I would just say about this is when we're speaking about college students, I think that their stressors, especially during the pandemic, went unheard. And a lot of them felt unseen and unheard. And to those who were surrounding them, if that connectedness on whatever level could have been offered to them, I think it could have buffered a lot. So we did offer, after those who engaged in the treatment, after they received that, we did offer communications at 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months after, where we sent them a letter reminding them of the conversation that we had once they were stable in the emergency department.
You know, Ellen G, I think one thing that you highlighted really eloquently was, you know, how the landscape has changed. College campuses have changed how they are now addressing mental health needs. And particularly I mean, we already knew this before the pandemic, but what was really highlighted during the pandemic is how this age group communicates with each other is via a distant modality, online, passive, and it can be misinterpreted, and that can lead to, you know, really critical situations if they interpret it wrong, you know. So I think those are big takeaways, how things have changed.
That's a really great point, and I want to open it up to questions. Should there be any? That's a really great point, Larkin. There was difficulty at some point because we would say, okay, we're going to have to move from texting to actually talking to the person to clarify the meaning of what's being said here. And that would be a stressor for some people because they would say, actually, we only text or we only chat this way. I've never heard their voice. And how to move people from that, I guess, from that less intimate means of communication was hard. It was stressful. It was stressful for them, and they just needed support in doing that.
We're going to actually take the questions at the end of both. I want to make sure that we can get through both panels. And then we can
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for very interesting. So the next speaker, there's about 5 authors, but I'm only going to read the profiles of the first and the last just to keep it brief. So Dr. Diana Rodriguez Moreno, Ms. Rachel Goldblum, Dr. Kili Chesta-Postava, Professor Christina Hoven, and Dr. Yael Sikowitz are the authors. Dr. Diana Rodriguez Moreno, she is an assistant professor in psychiatry at Columbia University. She is a member of our group, the Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. She's a neuroscientist studying the neural substrates of cognitive processes using structural and functional imaging. Her early research involved both localization of low-level functions of the motor and sensory cortices for pre-surgical mapping in cancer patients and mechanisms of high-level processes related to language, math, and reasoning in healthy subjects. Her recent research focuses on adolescents' risky behaviors. Dr. Yael Sikowitz is the director of the Neurocognitive and Emotional Lab, which investigates attention, memory, and emotional regulation mechanisms and processes using different neural imaging modalities such as MEG, EEG, ERP, and fMRI. Currently, her research focuses on understanding the impact of trauma on mental health across the lifespan, its spread across generations, and its influence among family members. Welcome.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Let me go back to the beginning. Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Musa. I want to talk today about a little more experimental study, but it's very related to what Dr. McReynolds and Dr. DeGeneres were talking before about how substance use is being a big problem and the young population, and this population I'm going to talk about is a little younger. They're adolescents, not yet at college, they're at the homes, but it's very related to how these problems can be bigger and become bigger with stress and stress sensitivity that they suffer through chronic stress. Unlike the study that they were talking about, this was done pre-COVID, so we did not have that confound effect of the chronic stress with COVID. So let me go a little bit about what substance use disorders mean for people. The disorder is really, substance use disorder is really when people are using drugs, either any type of drug, alcohol, and at a level that is impairing the daily functioning of the person at work, at school, and the family activities, and usually impairs not only the person, but also the family around them, the people around them. In America, there are about 40 million Americans that have diagnosed SUD starting from age 12, where it's pretty early for having a disorder of such a type. And last year, or this year, early this year, was reported 100,000 overdose death, what is huge. And many of them could be like the harder drugs, like opiates, but some of them are also alcohol intoxications and so on. And alcohol is a very typical drug use on adolescents, where alcohol, as I think that Dr. DeGeneres mentioned, is very typical on females using an increased amount of alcohol. We can see on this graph here that substance use disorder, it can be already appear on young adolescents, age 12 to 17, and we have a 7% prevalence according to this graph, and that increases tremendously towards the age 18 to 25, and then likely decrease to 15% on adults. What this picture shows is that first, that the fact that adolescents so young can have a substance use disorder is really scary. And if we look not only at the disorder, but severe use, we see that 12% of teens indicate severe use. So they are good candidates to become later having substance use disorder as they grow. Luckily, the numbers go down, and that indicates that there is treatment and there is remission of substance use disorder. However, we want to look at this problem before it starts. It's good to have solutions for substance use disorder, but it's better to prevent it. So we care about how adolescents really are so susceptible to initiation of drug use and to then develop a disorder, and see if we can predict any of the factors that can actually influence this behavior. So we look at the adolescent substance use disorders, and we know that typically substance use disorders start young, between around age 12, and then increases up to age 21. Substance use, I'm sorry. And this increase during adolescence is typical because there are other behaviors that are known in adolescents. For example, they have increased stress activity, they have increased reward sensitivity, so they are looking for things that are pleasurable. They have a stronger impulsivity and risk-taking behaviors. They do crazy things. We all know the teenagers have more exposed to doing drunk driving, unprotected sex, using drugs, as the case of what we're talking today. But this is not something bad. This is normative behavior in adolescence that is given by the developmental and sexual maturation. Adolescents are expected to have this outgoing on the world and experience new things. So they do need to have this drive to look for novelty, to look for things that are better, to experience things that are different than before. So this is normative, and this is a little bit what Dr. Reynolds was talking before, McReynolds, about going to college and then becoming adults and having this exposure to new worlds. They need this bump in stress activity, they need this bump in reward seeking. So this is all normal. This cognitive development is changing the brain and the body functions, and it changed the emotion regulation circuits, the cognitive control circuits, and also the stress activity of the body. Besides of these biological changes, there are environmental factors that also increase the risk for substance use initiation. And those has to do with the school, how safe the school is, how much drugs are available, peer pressure to use or not drugs, and then parental psychopathologies that it will increase the risk for substance use, especially if the parents have substance use disorder themselves. That could be like a model for the kids, or that could also be increased availability of drugs for them. So we want to look at few of these variables. Not all of them I'm going to present today. We look at the stress reactivity, and we look at the factor of having a parent that has a substance use disorder. So when we talk about the stress reactivity, we have to think about two different ways. One is when there is an acute stress, and we talked today about walking onto a very high traffic street that has a lot of cars coming, and how people will think on that. If we don't think on something that is suicidal, if we think on a common person that is not trying to do any harm to themselves and walking on a busy street, and suddenly a car is coming to the person, the first reaction is to move right away. And this reaction that happens immediately is because the whole system reacts to that stress. That acute stress first triggers the autonomic nervous system that will increase the, and then will trigger, that system will trigger the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis to create the cortisol hormone that is a stress hormone. And that will change, create a lot of responses on the body to do what is called the fight or flight response. This is a normal situation. So we expect adolescents that don't have a chronic stress to have this acute response whenever something bad happens. Now, there is a difference between females and males on the heart rate. Females usually have higher heart rate, and that is part of also the developmental changes with hormonal changes that happen during puberty. When stress is chronic, like having a parental, a parent, a father and a mother with SUD at the home, and that is a heavy thing for an adolescent, that chronic stress will impact these systems, creating a different response. So it will modify both the autonomic nervous system and the HPA axis to have either greater or lower response. So it's a response for an acute, so after chronic exposure that happens all the time. In this case, we were talking about a street that is very, very crowded, a heavy highway with a lot of traffic. People going into that, it could that they become very sensitive. Anytime they see a car coming to them, they will react much more, or they could become habituated. They will react much less. So there are these two ways of changing and modulating the response system after chronic stress. So we expect that kids that have a chronic stress or having a parent with SUD will have a different reaction to acute stress than those that don't have that parental history of SUD. So luckily, we were doing a study already, the adolescent imaging study, that was looking at drug use initiation on adolescents. These adolescents at the beginning of the study were naive, drug naive, and they all come from families that live on impoverished and difficult neighborhoods on the South Bronx of New York City. Half of them have this chronic stress given by the family history of SUD, and in this case, we call it FH+. And this FH+ was given, we determined it was either lifetime, so sometimes before the examination, or on the last examination that the group did, GPEC did. This is a study done at GPEC, Dr. Hoven's lab, with the help of all the different members. So the main idea of the study then was to, since we had this sample, was to compare how was the stress reactivity in these adolescents that had either parental history of SUD or not, and then also compare how it was the stress reactivity for females versus males. And the first hypothesis was that the FH+ adolescents will have greater stress reactivity than FH- given the chronic stress they were exposed. The second hypothesis was that females that normally are more reactive will have a greater stress reactivity too, compared to males. So the way to look at stress, acute stress in the lab is use social stress. There is a well-studied task that is called the tiered social stress task that has a public speech component and a math component. Besides of the particular things that the the person has to do, the setup is very important. The setup has to be professional with interviewers, 2 or 3 interviewers that are becoming the audience for the speech, and they had to be unfamiliar for the person, for the subject. These 2 or 3 interviewers had different roles. Only one of them really interacts with the participant and gives instructions. All of them become very neutral. They don't give any positive or negative feedback to the participant. And that's key because the participant needs to be feeling not supported, so it gets really stressed. And one of them holds a camera, telling them that they are being recorded, and that recording is going to be evaluated by psychiatrists later on. So they are really having this pressure of speaking in public and being evaluated. So this evaluation of the person creates tremendous stress on people, and especially in adolescents, where it's a time that they try to create new social bonds. Let me tell you a little more about the design, how this worked. When the adolescent came into the room, only one of the interviewers was there and gave the adolescent the heart rate monitor device that was attached to a band that was put on the chest. So after the adolescent came back, it was only told to sit down and rest for a few minutes, 3 minutes. They had to sit down, no phone, no talking, just resting. So during the whole time, because we had already the heart rate monitor, we could monitor the heart rate. So we took a continuous measure of heart rate. After the baseline, the adolescent didn't know anything about the task yet. The task was explained, and they told them that they had to prepare a speech. The task usually for adults is a preparation of an interview, like a job interview. They are told they had to go in front of the audience and present themselves for that job. Here, the preparation was not for that. It was tailored for adolescents at school. So we told them that they had to prepare a speech. Imagining they were going to a new school, they didn't know any of the peers on the classroom, and the teacher asked them to be in front, stand up, and talk to the other peers and present themselves and introduce themselves so they could become friends with the others. They have only 3 minutes to prepare the speech, and they could take notes. After the 3 minutes, all the interviewers came in the room. The other 2 interviewers were totally new for them, and the person has to present the speech. And the speech has to be told during the 3 minutes. If at any point the teenager stopped, it was reminded that they still had time and had to continue. So that was stressful because they could start at the beginning right away and talk, but then they ran out of words and they had to continue. They were always reminded. Once they finished a speech, they didn't know that they were not done yet. They thought they finished. It was a surprise task that consisted of math. And it wasn't an easy math. It was a really hard math. It was subtracting numbers from 300 by 7, counting down. And obviously it depends a little bit on how much schooling they have. For some kids were harder than others, but whenever time they made a mistake, they had to restart over from the beginning. So there was this pressure to do it perfectly well. And then that was for 2 minutes, and then there was another math, a little easier for 1 minute. After that, they were told, okay, you're done, please just rest. And while they were resting, we explained to them, we did the debriefing, because it was a very stressful task, and we wanted them to be back to normal on their heart rate. We wanted them to be happy and not be angry. The reaction, it was mixed. Some adolescents were very happy and laughed when we told them that this was a stress task. We could not tell them that it was a stress task ahead of time, because otherwise they would not get stressed. So we had to just pretend we were, mini interviewers looking at them, very serious, but the interviews were friendly, so everybody kind of relaxed and they were happy. Other teenagers were like completely angry, like, how could you do this to me? This is not fair. They all had signed consent, of course, for the study, and they all knew that there was a task. And we have, of course, IRB permission to do this kind of task. It's always on like that. You do the stress, and then you debrief the subjects and you explain to them. So we took different times, depending on the people, to be calm down, be happy, relax. And then we asked them to, for the last 5 minutes, sit down and just relax, forget about everything, just be ready to go home. So during the last 5 minutes, we had what was for us the recovery baseline. And we expected that throughout the task, our recordings, we expected that it would show the baseline heart rate could go back, would be the same to the recovery baseline. And of course, we expected the heart rate to increase, especially during the speech and the math. throughout the whole task, we have few times we ask the participants to report how they were feeling. So we, besides of measuring the heart rate, we wanted to know how they felt. Do they feel stressed? Do they feel hungry? We only care about the perceived stress, I feel, but to make the task not obvious about the stress perception or stress, we put other questions. So we asked them if they were hungry, and many of them were, if they were comfortable or confident, how they were feeling. So there were all these questions. So all our measures are really the heart rate conditions. We have the heart rate across all these different time points. We use a heart rate for the whole baseline and the whole recovery, but we only use a heart rate for the first 30 seconds of each one of these conditions because we have a lot of difference on how they perform the task. We wanted to make it unified and similar. So we only use the first 30 seconds for those heart rates. And then we use the self-report for the perceived stress. We have from this investigation done at a different task, we had the trait anxiety inventory that we use also as to control for anxiety, because people that are anxious, obviously we have more reactivity to stress than others. The way we analyze this data was using linear mixed effect models, where we look at the heart rate as a function of the different task conditions and also function of the anxiety the person may have. But our main factors were, of course, the sex and the FH group. We did the same kind of model for the perceived stress here, also using the different conditions for the heart rate and looking at the sex, the FH group, and the state trait score. We also look at the interactions between the sex and the group and the sex and the conditions. So as for demographics, the first part we want to see is that the groups are similar. We want to know that we have an homogeneous population. As you can see here, we had 62 subjects. We originally had more subjects that we wanted to do. Our original study, the adolescent imaging study, had 125 subjects, but we got caught by COVID and we couldn't continue doing it the same way. Not only because there were differences there are many reasons why not to continue the study doing the stats after COVID. One is that the conditions that was set before, I explained that was very maintained conditions where the interviewer has to sit at a certain distance, they had to look the same way. And here with COVID, we had to wear masks, we had to keep social distance between the interviews with the participant. So all the setup was really difficult and changed. And also we had the very chronic stress of COVID that was like so current, that was hard. And then people will not be accommodating to come to the lab to do this task either. So there were many reasons why we wanted to keep clean the data from before COVID and just look at that. As you can see here, we have about the same amount of FH plus and FH minus group, and we have about the same number of females than males. And we can see that there is no big difference. There is no difference between the ages across the groups, as well as there are no difference between the environment that they are on, the household income, and the parental education, and there is no difference on race. So a very homogeneous group where we really can focus on SUD, on the parents, on half of them, and the difference between sexes. Just to look at the first overall, how the heart rate changed across everybody, to know that our task is working, we can see that compared to baseline, this is what is shown at the table, compared to the baseline, there is a reference, all the other conditions are greater except the recovery. What it means that really when people get rested at the end, the heart rate goes back to normal. And we have an increase already during the pre-speech. When they are preparing, they already get nervous and stressed, but the peak of the stress really is at this public speech and then at the math. So that's expected result, and we were very happy with that. Then we look at the main effect of group. When we look at group as a main effect, we don't see differences. As you can see, there is no significant difference across the whole time for the group. When we look at sex, we see that there are differences. As expected, as we said before, females have higher heart rate than males. So we see across the conditions, we observe the same. And this is significantly different. On this, by our measure, they have greater 9 heartbeat beats per minute on the heart rate. When we look at the interaction, because main effects may not be important, if there is an interaction effect, all the effect of that factor may go to the interaction. We look at the interaction between group and sex, and we actually found interaction. only at the time of the speech. So if we look at a speech versus baseline, the first thing we want to know is that the speech is always greater than the baseline for all the 4 groups we have. If we look here on the graph for the 4 groups, we can see that at the baseline, this is lower than the 4 groups here. So we do have, as we saw before, we have an increase from baseline to a speech condition. That's the greater increase. So is there an interaction at that point between the different groups, between the sex and the group at the speech time? If we take the male FH minus group as a reference, then we can see that the male FH plus group is different than the male FH minus group, suggesting that there is an increase, and as you can see here, there is an increase on reactivity on the FH plus male groups. If we look at the FH minus females, there is also a difference with them. However, the FH plus minus, it shows no difference between them. So the group here, the FH minus group, the female is different, the sex is different, and the FH plus and minus group, the males are different. And the FH plus females have no difference. What was a little bit puzzling for us, because we thought that the FH plus females would be different, but that's exactly why it's giving us an interaction effect. We also look at the perceived stress that they reported, and we see that first, if we compare to the baseline, the only conditions were different between the baseline and the rest of the conditions. For the FH plus group, the only condition different was the math. On the contrary, for the FH minus group, the conditions were different. It looks like this stress was elevated, always the perceived stress, but then it decayed. So somehow the FH plus group didn't feel stress except on the math, and the FH minus group felt stressed all the time, but then at the recovery, they become relaxed, and that's when it's different. And because these are increasing on one group and decreasing on the other one, we see this interaction effect between the group and the condition, and on the math and the debriefing. So to summarize the results, we saw, as we expected, we saw that the heart rate overall increases during the speech and the math. We saw that they were not, the females were different, had greater heart rate than the males, as expected too. And we didn't see difference between the FH plus and FH minus groups on the heart rate, because we saw that effect on the interaction. So we did have an interaction between the groups and the sex on the heart rate during the speech condition only, with that FH plus males had greater increase than the FH minus males. So that was kind of the group effect, and the FH minus males show greater increase than the FH minus males. That was the sex effect. And we have, as I said before, an interaction between the group and the self-reported stress, showing that for the FH plus, only the math condition was a problem, while for the FH minus, they get less stress at the end when they go after the debriefing. To conclude our study, we saw that what we predicted, that family history of substance use and sex play a role in the stress reactivity to acute stress response in adolescence. We saw that this is true. And particularly, we saw that compared to the FH minus males, that would be the group that is our control, that has no parental SUD, and we look at the males. If we look at FH plus males that do have a parent at home, we see that those FH plus kids, boys, had greater reactivity to stress due to the chronic stress of having a parent at home. So we think that this is a sensitization of the stress system on the FH plus boys. In contrast, the FH plus females did not show that increase. What it was, we didn't expect that, but because the FH plus, because the females have a greater activity in general than the males, we have a comparison then that showed that the FH plus females really are maybe having a dampened stress reactivity compared to the other group. So we think that the stress reactivity that we're having is a sexually dimorphic effect, where on the FH plus adolescents, they have an stress reactivity that will increase maybe, if they feel more stressed, they will increase the use of substance because they feel more stressed. They will have a more using coping behavior, while the females FH plus, they have a damper reactivity. They will use maybe drugs, and they will go into using drugs mostly because they are looking for sensation seeking to new rewarding experiences. So even when the two factors are playing a role on how the stress reactivity changes, it may be that for substance use disorders, it shows different pathways, with one having more reactivity and one having less reactivity. And finally, we also look at the self-reported stress, and it's interesting that the FH minus adolescents feel nervous very hard, but they have a better way of controlling their feelings, while the FH plus adolescents almost feel like dampened. Nothing is happening to me, almost, except for the math, that they feel a little bit of a bump. So they have different feelings of really what is going on. I want to thank all the people on the CHIPEC lab that made this work possible. And also in particular, I want to help my colleagues, Dr. Sikowicz, that was instrumental on the data analysis and interpretation of the data, as well as Dr. Czesław Postava, that also decide the analysis. And all the people that really got the data, acquired the data, Ms. Sharon Kuchakovic, Cassie Alden, and Jacob Merritt, that were there with the participants implementing the task. That was not a simple task. And then Ms. Rachel Goldblatt for the manuscript revision that we actually are close to submit soon, hopefully. And also, I would like to thank all the participants' family for staying with us and doing this hard task, and the funding agencies that this work was supported by NIDA. Thank you very much also for all the people in the audience.
Wonderful, thank you. Do you have questions for either of the sections? Yeah.
Thank you for that talk. I don't know if you can hear me. Dr. Moreno?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. My question is specific to the FH plus and the FH minus differences that you observed, the main effects. My question is, one, was there, did you test that slope or that difference? And the reason why I'm asking, and this is between the FH plus and the FH minus, I wonder if time to recovery for these kids who experienced this stress activity was a factor, and would you have expected to see a difference in time for recovery, or difference in the change of recovery for those who had a dampened versus a heightened effect between FH plus and FH minus?
When I look at the interactions, and when I look at that graph, you could see also that the only time when there was difference between the baseline and the four groups was with the speech condition and not at the recovery time. I also had the feeling that maybe some of them recovered late, like took more or less time to recover, but we did not observe that difference here. Yes.
So that slope that we saw was not significant between those two groups.
I'm sorry?
The slope, the change that we saw, it was not significant between those two groups? You
mean on the perceived stress?
Yes.
The perceived stress, it is different because we had differences at the end on how the difference were on the math and the debriefing, not on the last part. Yes. But that's perceived stress, it's not real heart rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, between the two groups.
Yeah.
I have a question just about the perceived stress on if the task had been something other than math. I mean, why is math a particular stressor? And because we know there are gender differences and racial, ethnic differences on that as well. Performance, at least.
Yeah, most of the TSST is usually performed in the way that speech is always done first and math second. And we think that there could be like a confounding effect there, that because it's the first task, the speech is bigger, giving more stress than the math. And only one I saw only one paper where the math is done first and not the speech. And then the increase on heart rate was greater for the speech. Now, what is interesting is that regardless of how we have the heart rate, the perceivedness of them, when we asked them, was the math more stressful than the speech? And it did not correlate with what we see as perceived stress, and it did not correlate with what we see as the heart rate. So
that's important. Yeah.
That's fascinating for us, because what they said on the moment, it may not be actually with what they are marking on every time that we ask them how stressed you are. That doesn't go with that. So it looks like the self-perception they have, there are different things. One is that the self-perception is not great. Second is that they are not telling us what they think or how they feel because they are embarrassed. So it's always hard. Self-report is always hard, right? That's why we have the heart rate. That would be the most accurate measure we can have. And the other one is how they perceive or how they want us to perceive it. So, and it's very hard to disentangle, especially with some of them were happy, some of them were angry. I could say that the math seems to be more objective than the speech, less social. So maybe for that, what it was asked before, maybe because of that, the FH plus would say, oh, math was bad. I feel bad on the math. I reported bad because I can see that other people will see it and say bad, but the social, I will keep it like, oh, it was fine. So there are a lot of different interpretations you can get from here, but those are interpretations. They're hard to know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we actually had, you weren't here, so I don't know if you've heard it, but we had a giggle in the audience, because we actually have some wonderful students here with us. And I'm to ask you, what's more stressful for you, math or speaking in public? What do you think? So we got 2 maths and 1 speaking in public. So there you go.
Yeah, I think that they are both very hard, and especially it's not an easy math, and especially the part that is a surprise math is hard. But the whole point of the task is really make people uncomfortable. It could be any other thing, but because they are tasks done in animals to cause acute stress that is more physiological, and it's done in humans too. You could put someone's hand on a freezing bucket and keep it for 2 minutes until it's almost painful. And that generates a very acute response, but it's more physiological. And we think that what we're seeing on SUD, what we care about more like the psychiatric disorders, doesn't have to do so much. It has to do with how the body responds, but our stimuli of stress are usually more social and what is going around. And this is why we wanted to look at this, because someone that has a parent with SUD and is living under this chronic stress is probably going to respond different from something acute. And looking for support, like you were talking on the previous talk, looking for support versus having chronic stress is going to be different. If people cannot manage stress, they may not be able to look for support. If people can manage it, then maybe they can. And I it's kind of very different between girls and boys, I think, how they are going to manage this chronic stress and the acute stress on top of that. So if they had the chronic stress of the parental SUD, or maybe a college, like you were saying, the COVID, then what happens when they have another stress, that is that they break up with the boyfriend, or someone is giving them drugs, or they have an exam and they cannot study. So they're going to break down in different ways. And maybe for what we see here is that the girls will maybe be more willing to use drugs as a way of getting that extra reward that they're not getting because of what is going with COVID and staying at home. And the boys are going to be very reactive and go to use drugs as a way of maybe dampening the response that they have and accommodating to the situation. So I think that the way that people respond to stress is really dependent on the gender.
Yeah.
And this is showing, and probably I wanted to ask you, Dr. DeGeneres, during the emergency room, when you were having those visits, if you did have more girls coming with suicidal behavior than boys, and if you have more of the girls looking for services than the boys, because we think that asking for help is a little easier maybe for girls than for boys.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, we actually saw more severe, and this is so consistent with literature. We saw more severe suicide attempts, more lethal suicide attempts with males than with females, but we actually had about 50-50. So both males and females were presenting during the pandemic. But we did have more lethality among the males than the female. And to your latter question, help-seeking services, because we are at the point of at the ED, everyone had to be discharged with a plan. So we did not see differences there with the help-seeking, but we did see differences, sex differences with follow-up and adherence, where the females were more adherent, more likely to respond back in the text or pick up the phone, while males, there was just a little bit more persistence. The data shows that half of suicide attempters do not follow up, and they're easy to lose. So we were already primed and trained to be persistent, but it was far easier to get in touch with the girls after then.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
So just to piggyback on that, so you showed, the bar graphs and so on. Were you able to compare to pre-COVID, and what is the sort of, how much more during COVID did you have, if we had any more suicidal behavior during COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Dr. McReynolds, you can jump in. That Ray et al. Paper that I cited actually spoke about there was no difference between, while there were greater presentation of youth in the ED for mental health problems in general, that there was no difference between the amount of suicide attempts that we had in that pandemic period when compared to the year prior. Absolutely.
So I piggyback on that. We saw not a drastic increase in the comparative rates of suicide for college students. However, now in the past 4 to 5 months, there has been a increase in 18 to 24-year-old suicide fatalities.
And what do you attribute that? Is that because of the returning back to in-person classes, being away from, so if you can't do your classes at home, where your families are, where you have your support circle, could that be into being away at school, loneliness, being, lack of social support? Is that a possibility?
So the jury's still out on what's the larger risk. The two that have been most frequently cited have been continued loss of expectations for their age group and increase in alcohol.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, the clinical observers, external observers, they're more likely, since they've returned to school, they're more likely to come in contact with someone who reports. So we also simultaneously during the pandemic, we had a decrease in ACS or CPA reports, children's service reports of distress and abuse. They were just less.
So now they're back together and people have more avenues of reporting, and that we've now had the 988 line introduced last month and 2 months ago. So.
Yeah, and also primary care physician. We have data showing that young people stayed out of their physician's office during the COVID pandemic, but now they're returning, and you also get reports from doctors.
Interesting.
I have one interesting fact. I talked to athletic director at a major university athletic program. He's spending, so let's just imagine he has a multi-million-dollar budget. He is spending more on mental health care for his student athletes than he is on athletic trainers at this point. So it's a major overhaul in how colleges and universities are treating student mental health.
I think that there were a lot of problems before the pandemic, And the pandemic exacerbated a lot of situations that were not really taken care of. And colleges were not really picking up the pace of being responsible for the students and taking care of them. And now it's obvious that they had to do much more. After pandemic, when things are kind of returning to normal, that I think that there is a much higher increase of services by the universities. I'm doing college tours with my daughter, and everybody's advertising the services they have to everyone, just in case. And we had this, and we had this, and counselors, and 24/7 services, and it's very important. And I think that the students are also asking for that. They go and they ask, and that's very different, that there is no such a stigma as before to ask for, will you have counseling if I'm feeling bad and I can call my mom, or I don't have friends and I can go and see someone. So I think that that's very important, that is changing how the students realize that they need to ask for help. It's still, I think that people with depression, people that are in a bad moment, have a really hard time asking for help, but I think that is a step forward.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, therapeutic dogs are allowed on campus now.
Yep. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for your good questions. And it was nice to see people in the audience space. Hope you all enjoyed it. And reach out if you have any questions or want to collaborate.